Fans have been curious about what actually transpired and why this story still evokes such strong feelings in Nashville for years. Come along as we reflect on Roy Clark's disclosures. David Stringbean Akeman's early years. Stringbean, whose real name is David Akeman, was born on June 17, 1915, in the hills of Jackson County, Kentucky. The country, the era, and the close-knit family who reared him all influenced his formative years. The majority of families in Jackson County, a rural area, subsisted on farming and manual work. Although life was simple, it was also difficult. Families had to make do with what they had, and comfort frequently took a back seat to survival. The Akeman family had multiple children, including David. To put food on the table, his parents put in a lot of effort. He also learned early on that each member of the family had a responsibility. Not much money was available for pleasures or extras. Instead of replacing something that was broken, it had to be fixed. The family made their own entertainment if they wanted it, whether it was through storytelling, music, or get-togethers with neighbors. He had a strong regard for hard labor and the little pleasures that come from family and community as a result of this straightforward manner of living. When he was younger, David wished he had his own banjo, but finances were tight. At the time, his family just could not afford to purchase an instrument. He wasn't the type to give up lightly, though. He constructed a banjo-like instrument for himself using what he could find: an old shoebox, a stick, and some strings. Although it didn't seem like much, it gave him the opportunity to practice and start mastering the sounds that captivated him. His foray into music began with his handcrafted banjo. His perseverance eventually paid off. David made a deal when he was young that demonstrated his passion for music as well as the hardships that rural families frequently faced. He offered a real banjo in return for 2 hens. The exchange was worth 100-fold to him. That instrument grew to be his best friend and was seldom far from his side. He taught himself tunes and rhythms and practiced non-stop after that day until the banjo became an extension of himself. But David had to endure some of the most difficult years in American history before music could completely remove him from farm life. When he was still a young man, the Great Depression struck, causing banks to fail, jobs to vanish, and already struggling families to have much less left over. For individuals such as the Akemans, the Depression was more than simply news stories. It was neighbors losing farms they had devoted their entire lives to maintaining, empty cabinets, and long days of labor for little money. David joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, a government organization designed to provide young men with jobs during the Depression, in order to support himself and his family. During his time in the Corps, he assisted in the improvement of public land, the planting of trees, and the construction of roads. The world would soon witness how this tall, slender Kentucky boy transformed those early lessons into a career that would have people singing, laughing, and remembering him for decades to come. However, the darkness surrounding him also became brighter as his story did. He became Stringbean because of his fear of losing money, which was the one thing he could never let go of. Music was more than just a pastime by the time David Akeman was in his late teens and early 20s. It was turning into a way ahead. He was already well known in his hometown of Kentucky for being a talented banjo musician and an innate performer. He was always present with his banjo at any neighborhood competition or event. He had the ability to win people over. Not just in his playing but also in his sense of humor. He had a talent for interjecting a humorous line or teasing remark in between songs, and that blend of humor and music set him apart right away. An elderly musician named Asa Martin took notice of David at one of these competitions. Martin was a well-known entertainer in Kentucky who frequently asked up-and-coming artists to share the stage with him. The tall, thin young man who made the audience laugh while playing the banjo with such emotion amazed him. David was given the opportunity to perform at events outside of his small community when Martin asked him to join his band. However, the stage name that people would eventually know David by was not yet established. Asa Martin once forgot David's last name when he introduced him on stage. Martin immediately filled the void by referring to him as Stringbeans while glancing at his slack physique. The name stayed because the audience enjoyed it. It was eventually abbreviated to Stringbean, which became David's unchangeable identity in the music industry. The moniker fit him as well as his banjo from that point on. Stringbean's career took off after gaining a stage name and increasing experience. When he joined the Bluegrass Boys, Bill Monroe's band, in the early 1940s, it was his big break. New talent could flourish in Bill Monroe's band, which was already establishing him as the father of bluegrass. In addition to being an honor, Stringbean saw joining Monroe's group as an opportunity to study under some of the greatest musicians of the era. Stringbean started collaborating with other performers after departing from Monroe's ensemble, and his relationship with Grandpa Jones was one of the most significant collaborations of his life. Jones was a comedic comedian and banjo player who shared Stringbean's passion for vintage humor in music. As they performed together in shows that combined music with lighthearted humor, the two became close friends and business partners. They became mainstays in the country entertainment industry thanks to their onstage chemistry, which won over the crowd. When Stringbean began performing at Nashville's Grand Ole Opry, it was the true turning point in his career. Being able to perform at the Opry, the epicenter of country music, was seen as a sign of genuine achievement. The Opry was more than just a venue for Stringbean's performances. It was there that he cultivated the theatrical persona that won him national adoration. Stringbean created a unique performing style on the Opry stage by fusing his comic performances with banjo playing. Additionally, he created a distinctive style that viewers never forgot. His clothes included old-fashioned caps, big pants held up with suspenders, and large shirts. He looked a little goofy in the attire, but that was the idea. Before he even said a word, it caused everyone to laugh. Together with his humor and playing, the costume contributed to Stringbean's reputation as a light-hearted, modest banjo player who never took himself too seriously. Stringbean's life will soon change once more when he met the woman who would be his lifelong companion. Estelle's life. David Stringbean Akeman married Estelle Stanfill in 1945, as the nation was starting to transition back to peacetime and World War II was coming to a conclusion. Their union became the stable core of his life, providing him with the warmth and sense of belonging he had always cherished. Everyone who knew Estelle knew her to be quiet, gentle, and incredibly encouraging. Despite her preference for staying out of the spotlight, she was always proud of Stringbean and supported him throughout his career. Quiet devotion was a common description of the couple's relationship. Despite the fact that they were childless, their relationship remained strong. Musicians and friends saw how much they cared for each other. It was Stringbean who filled stages with music and made audiences laugh. Estelle, however, provided him with security and tranquility when he was not performing. Even though they kept their love to themselves, it was evident in the manner they cohabitated. Shortly after their marriage, Stringbean and Estelle found a house that reflected their individuality. They decided to reside in Ridgetop, Tennessee, in a modest log cabin. Many of Stringbean's contemporaries spent their wealth and notoriety on fancy vehicles, bigger homes, or other indulgences, but the Ackermans took a different route. Their cabin was rustic, comfortable, and uncomplicated. It featured poultry that produced eggs, a wood burner for warmth, and a garden that Estelle meticulously maintained. They prepared the majority of their meals from scratch, frequently using items they had personally farmed or reared. Some fans who watched Stringbean perform on the iconic television show Hee Haw or on stage every week at the Grand Ole Opry may have been taken aback by this kind of living. It could have seemed strange to outsiders that a well-known performer would have such a simple life. But it was the only thing that seemed right to Stringbean and Estelle. To feel successful, they didn't require ostentatious items. Simple life, gardening, hunting, fishing, and spending peaceful time together after the stage's music and laughing had ended were the sources of their happiness. Stringbean's intense mistrust of banks was one of the reasons they had such a modest life. His early years during the Great Depression were marked by this mistrust. He had witnessed families lose their savings in an instant when banks closed when he was a young guy. The anxiety and powerlessness that grew during those years stayed with him forever. And it influenced his financial management for the remainder of his life. He refused to keep his money in banks even after he became successful and earned a consistent income from music. Stringbean decided to keep his profits near instead. He always had cash with him, and he discovered odd hiding spots to hide dollars at home. According to some, he concealed cash in the chimney. Others said it was concealed between loose bricks in the walls or beneath the flooring. In town, rumors circulated swiftly, although it was never clear how much he had concealed. There were rumors circulating that Stringbean might have thousands of dollars hidden away in that tiny home. On the surface, their home life was tranquil, but eventually, their behaviors, particularly the concealed money, would draw unwanted attention. And soon the worst people would be the ones giving that attention. The night of death. November 10, 1973, started out like any other Saturday for the majority of those who knew David Stringbean Akeman. Stringbean rarely deviated from his routine, and tonight was no exception. He was supposed to play at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, so he and Estelle got ready for their weekly journey there. Stringbean was feeling upbeat at the Opry that night. As usual, he amused the audience by playing his banjo and sharing his quips. Later, other musicians recalled that the evening didn't seem out of the ordinary. As usual, Estelle accompanied him. Backstage, she was a silent presence. While pleasantly conversing with others, she continued to focus on her husband. Being by her side was just a part of Stringbean's life with her. After the conclusion of the Opry, Stringbean proceeded as normal. After leaving the program, he and Estelle returned to their property in Ridgetop, Tennessee. By all accounts, the drive was routine, and nothing seemed unusual. It was simply another Saturday night to the outer world. However, problems were already brewing at Stringbean's house while he was entertaining audiences with his music and making them laugh. Earlier that night, two cousins, John and Marvin Brown, who had both committed larceny and small-time crimes, had broken into the Akeman cabin. They had been restless and impoverished as children, frequently in legal problems, and had recently increased their recklessness. The same allegations that had been going about for years, that Stringbean mistrusted banks and concealed significant sums of money in his home, were repeated to the Browns. There were rumors going around town that there might be thousands of dollars hidden behind the walls, beneath his floors, or in his chimney. These speculations sounded like an opportunity to the Browns. They pushed their way into the cabin and waited that November evening. They had a straightforward plan. When Stringbean got home, they would ambush him, scare him, and steal any cash they could find. They believed that the humble tiny house held a secret wealth. It was almost midnight when Stringbean and Estelle got home from the Opry. Unaware of the danger within, they parked the car and proceeded toward the cabin. First in was Stringbean. He was nearly immediately confronted by the Browns. According to accounts, Stringbean was struck close to the entryway by the initial bullet fired by John Brown. He fell and was dead practically immediately. Terrified, Estelle fled back out of the cabin and headed for the car in the hopes of getting help or escaping. She didn't get very far, though. She was pursued by Marvin Brown, who shot her outside close to the car. The couple's peaceful existence came to an abrupt end in a violent outburst within minutes. Desperate to uncover the money they thought was buried in the cabin, the Browns searched. However, they discovered significantly less than they had anticipated. Only a modest amount of cash was found, despite their notion that thousands of dollars were hidden away. There was no sign of the remaining reported treasure. Grandpa Jones, Stringbean's close friend and fellow Opry star, showed up to the cabin the following morning. The two had decided to go hunting together, which was something they frequently did together. When Jones arrived at the house, he anticipated seeing Stringbean prepared with his equipment. Rather, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jones noticed Estelle's body next to the automobile. He ran to the house in shock and found Stringbean laying inside, just past the door. As soon as he realized what had happened, he went to seek assistance. He would later characterize the incident as one of the most agonizing recollections he had ever held. Grandpa Jones could never forget discovering his close friends in such a dreadful state, even though he lived for many years afterward. Nashville and the larger country music community were rocked by the murder's swiftly spreading news. Neighbors were astounded, as were fans and other performances. It seemed inconceivable that this modest, good-hearted couple could be interpreted in such a cruel manner. The pursuit of justice would soon start, revealing information that astounded friends and admirers alike. The Nashville community was in shock at the hunt for the murderers of Stringbean and Estelle Akeman. While neighbors speculated about who could have committed such a heinous deed, friends and admirers lamented. Suspicion quickly spread, and the trail ultimately led to John and Marvin Brown, two cousins who were already well known to the police. The small hamlet of Ridgetop was a hive of activity in the days after the killings. Everyone was aware of the long-running stories regarding Stringbean's secret wealth, and many immediately surmised that the motivation had been thievery. However, what initially attracted significant attention was the abrupt actions of John and Marvin Brown. Both guys had criminal histories, primarily related to theft, and their reputations caused suspicion. However, their expenditures were the most notable aspect. Locals remarked that the Browns appeared to have more money than normal just after the deaths. They were talking too freely, flaunting their money, and purchasing items they couldn't regularly afford. This immediately stood out in a tiny community where everyone noted little changes. Some others who knew them discreetly told the authorities about their worries. Investigators thought the cousins might actually be involved in the crime because of their flamboyant manner and free conversation. Police started keeping a careful eye on the Browns. They gathered testimonies from residents who had observed the abrupt shift in their routines. Some claimed to have overheard the men discussing money or string beans in ways that didn't set well with them. Others remarked on their apparent nervousness when the murders were brought up. Investigators also looked for tangible proof. The crucial element was linking the crime scene directly to the Browns, even though a large portion of it had already revealed the events that transpired within the cabin. Police eventually acquired enough information to make a compelling case. The Browns were found in possession of a few stolen things that could be linked to the Akeman residence. The case against them became stronger every day when combined with the strange timetable of their movements and the extraordinary spending binge. The cops quickly gained confidence that they had their men. Within weeks of the killings, both cousins were taken into custody, which provided some respite to a neighborhood still reeling from the brutal deaths of two cherished neighbors. The arrests were just the start. The ensuing trial received a great deal of attention from the country music community as a whole, not just from the local community. The courtroom served as a platform for the fans' desire for Stringbean and Estelle to receive justice. There were multiple sources of testimonies. The man who had found the dead, Grandpa Jones, spoke movingly about the morning he arrived at the scene. In order to create the chronology of Stringbean's last hours, other artists from the Opry also discussed his personality and routine. From the Browns' questionable expenditures to their possession of stolen goods, investigators presented the evidence they had gathered. Ultimately, the court imposed severe penalties. The shooter, John Brown, was sentenced to 198 years in jail, ensuring that he would never be allowed to go free again. Although Marvin Brown was given a shorter term, it was still sufficient to keep him incarcerated for the remainder of his life. Later, he passed away in prison without ever being released. And even after the murderers were apprehended, everyone was still plagued by the mystery of Stringbean's secret wealth, the hidden fortune mystery. In 1973, Nashville and the country music community were devastated by the murder of David Stringbean Akeman and his wife, Estelle. However, another side of the tale emerged in the days and years that followed. Money concealed in the Akeman cabin, a mystery. It came out that there was a surprising amount of truth to the rumors that had been circulated for years. Following the killings, authorities searched the Akeman cabin and discovered cash hidden in odd locations. In one pair of boots were little bunches of money, concealed behind portions of the cabin's walls and nestled into the chimney. When everything was said and done, the concealed funds totaled about $20,000, which was a substantial sum for someone leading such a modest life in the early 1970s. Those who were familiar with Stringbean were not entirely surprised by this revelation. He had experienced the Great Depression, when many families lost everything due to bank failures. He developed a lifetime mistrust of financial institutions as a result of that encounter. He liked to have his profits in plain sight and within easy reach. He felt safer keeping money hidden in his house than entrusting it to others. Still, many were taken aback by the precise amount. Stringbean had always handled money with care. Even though he earned a respectable living from television and music, no one anticipated that he was secretly hoarding thousands of dollars. Speculation began as soon as the first money hoard was discovered. Fans and neighbors alike started to speculate about how much more Stringbean might have concealed. According to some, he had additional tens of thousands of dollars stashed away. Others maintained that the cabin was essentially a vault with hidden passageways just waiting to be discovered. The Akeman residence soon became a source of interest as a result of these rumors. Stories of trespassers and treasure seekers breaking onto the property at night began to circulate long after the killings, looking for another secret package. Interest in the alleged treasure never truly diminished, even though officials guarded the cabin following the incident. Like Stringbean's music and comedy, the story of his hidden money became part of his legend. For decades, there was a mystery surrounding a man who dispersed cash about his cabin because he was so suspicious of institutions. Then, almost 2 decades later, the whispers came to pass once more. Another secret store was discovered in 1996 while the cabin was being renovated. They discovered about $20,000 more in cash hidden behind a wall that had been sealed off for decades. But the bills had lost all of their value by then. They had been destroyed by time and moisture. The currency could not be exchanged, and the paper was rotten. As tangible evidence of Stringbean's habits, what had once been a tiny fortune had devolved into a curiosity. But no longer worth any money. More conjecture was only stoked by this second revelation. How much more might be buried in the cabin or nearby? Property if money had been buried thus deeply in the walls? The notion of unknown stashes has never completely disappeared, even though no more discovery have ever been recorded. The issue of who would inherit Stringbean's belongings was just as complicated as the mystery surrounding his secret wealth. Estelle and Stringbean were childless, and no will was discovered after they passed away. The estate was then left to be resolved in court. As family members from both sides filed claims, the court cases continued. The majority of the assets and property were eventually given to Estelle's relatives. However, the disagreements led to conflict, and the revelations of the concealed funds only made things more difficult. Every new discovery sparked debate about who should have access to it and who would gain the most in the long run. Ultimately, the courts divided a large portion of Stringbean's fortune. However, the procedure was clouded by the inquiries over his secret fortune. In addition to influencing his day-to-day existence, his decision to conceal money rather than entrust it to banks generated a legacy of mystery and strife following his passing. And despite the mystery surrounding the riches, supporters kept in mind what made Stringbean so unique. He made the world laugh and hear music. The gloomy fallout. The tragedy did not end quietly, even decades after Stringbean and Estelle Akeman were murdered. Unexpected choices, fresh events, and unanswered concerns kept the tragedy fresh in the public consciousness. The release of one of the murderers, John Brown, from jail in 2014 was one of the most startling events. The punishment for John Brown's conviction in the 1970s was designed to guarantee that he would never be allowed to walk free again. He had been imprisoned for 198 years. A phrase that made it clear how serious his offense was. That sentence provided some tiny solace to a lot of individuals. It implied that the man who pulled the trigger would be imprisoned for the rest of his life. However, it was announced in 2014, more than 40 years after the killings, that John Brown had been given parole. At the age of 64, parole officers contended that he was no longer a danger to the public. Outrage erupted over the decision. Disappointment was expressed by Stringbean's pals, country music enthusiasts, and Estelle's relatives. They believed that time spent in prison would never be enough to make up for the savagery of the crime. Many thought that Brown's release was a slight to the couple's memory and to the town, which had never really recovered from the tragedy. Even worse, Brown's own remarks following his release did little to alleviate tensions. He made contradictory remarks in interviews, at times expressing contrition and at other times coming across as cold and unrepentant. The resentment toward the parole decision was heightened by the perception held by many that he lacked genuine regret for his actions. Old questions that had never been adequately addressed also came back into prominence with the release of John Brown. The question of whether John and Marvin Brown had acted alone was one of the greatest puzzles. Some residents had long suspected the involvement of a third accomplice. It was believed that someone else had assisted in the crime's planning or had been present at the cabin that evening. The suspicion persisted even though nothing was ever confirmed. How the Browns were so familiar with Stringbean's timetable was another unsolved puzzle. His schedule was consistent. On Saturday nights, he would sing at the Opry before leaving for home. But did someone alert the Browns, or did they just exploit a well-known habit? Although there was never any proof to back up the theory, several conjectured that a neighbor or an Opry insider might have supplied information. Innumerable hypotheses and rumors developed over time in response to the unresolved questions. While some were certain that the Browns had acted alone but had just accurately predicted Stringbean's schedule, others thought they had inside information from someone close to him. After another $20,000 was found in the cabin walls in 1996, the stories about the hidden fortune further intensified. Who was to say there wasn't more money if it was still being found over 20 years later? This stoked conjecture that either additional cash was still buried somewhere undetected or that the Browns had stolen more than anyone had thought. There are still no definitive answers to these questions. Fans, historians, and people who recall the events are still speculating about the occurrences. For a lot of people, the mystery is what keeps the narrative interesting. Even yet, remembering the tragedy itself is still terrible. Please remember to hit the notification bell, like this video, and subscribe to the channel if you liked it so you don't miss what comes next.